Okay, first question. We would love to hear about your work with Smash and if we could relate that to Mesa here at GRC.
So the work with Smash would be, I'm trying to limit these answers because we want to make sure that the video, we can actually send the video. So the work of Smash, you can find out more about that from Revolutionary STEM Education because it's talking about Smash, and there's an article that I'll send to Tanya, Engineering Equity, that speaks to the work as well. And so the three things that were kind of most prevalent that came out during that work that I think are easily applicable to Mesa is this idea of critical reality pedagogy, which we talked about. It's a way to position students so that they can use their STEM knowledge as levers for social justice. And so there's an article that came out recently where it talks about, especially for students of color, if they can connect the work that they're doing in STEM to issues around justice, the engagement level increases exponentially. When engagement increases, so too does learning. And so then there are two things that you need to have in place in order for critical reality pedagogy to be realized. One is something I've termed socio-academic synergy, and that's inviting the language, the culture, the ways of being, the interests, the joys, the concerns of students of color into the curricular kind of focus of your class, right? So you work alongside them to figure out how to create new knowledge and how to apprehend kind of foundational knowledge. So what that looks like, for example, is working with students on things that are of interest to them, and then the third thing is critical contextualization. And so it's similar. It feeds into socioacademic synergy because what it does is it invites students to situate their learning in their real life experiences. We've all been in classes before where we ask the question, what does this have to do with my real life? And so what the work that you want to do in Mesa is answer those questions and allow students to answer those questions so that the work that they're doing they can take and use. And so again, go to Revolutionary STEM Education or the article Engineering Equity, and it's a more detailed analysis of that work.
Okay, thanks for that. How do you suggest having conversations with folks who do not possess a growth mindset? Not just anti-racist growth mindset, a growth mindset at all.
Right. And so that's a difficult conversation, and we have to realize that we're not going to be able to get everyone. The reality is that our brains can grow. So one of the ways that you can have this conversation, and I'm not saying that this is foolproof by any stretch of the imagination, is to just talk about growth mindset, which is what the question is, absent an anti-racist growth mindset. If you can talk to a person about how kind of neural pathways can be developed well into our 60s, that may be enough to encourage someone who was previously reticent to try to enter into a new work to do it. And it may not, right? Because ultimately it's a heart matter. So there's no easy answer for that. You're not just going to convince someone that they should do it. They have to have a heart for justice in order to begin to engage in this work in earnest.
Okay, along the same lines, how do we compassionately engage and invite those who are unwilling to acknowledge the need to do the work? It could be our coworker.
We're not going to be able to get everybody to do this work. If we were, right, we'd be much further along than we are now. The reality is this, in my experience at least, right? The reality of my experience in working with folks is that you have to do the work. Don't try to convince people to do the work. Start by doing the work, and then the rationale behind doing the work should become clear. That's why when I had the honor of speaking to you all on your opening day, I talked about this tool, the impact equity evaluation and cross-representational groups. And people understand that they have to do this, right? Because it's part of a college redesign. You don't have to suture the work to anti-racism or any other thing. You just do it as a college redesign. You audit your policies as part of a college redesign. And what will happen in doing that work, right, is that people will become more conversant in language around justice. And so I would start that way. Solidarity is built through doing the work. And another thing that we like to say is that action is the antithesis of ambivalence.
What are some ways in which we can practice an equity growth mindset in the classroom?
Okay, so that's a good question. I want to make sure I differentiate. So what I was pushing for was an anti-racist growth mindset. Equity is inherent in that, but an equity growth mindset is different, right? So that is somewhat tautological, right? So an equity mindset would be a mindset that is inviting the language and the culture and the ways of being of the students into the classroom space, not in a way that's merely celebratory, not in a way where we celebrate kind of vestiges of the past, though they're important, right, or ancestors, or not in the same way that kind of multicultural work tried to create more inviting classroom space. But you have to actually work with students, borrowing from what Professor Christopher Emdin talked about in for white folks that teach in the hood. You need to have co-generative dialogues. You need to be willing to co-teach. You need to identify students on a rotating basis that you can have conversations with to ask how the class is going. So that if you're going off or if you're losing students, you can hear from students and correct that. Right? This is commensurate with what's called design-based research. Instead of just doing a pre-post, right? I have these things I want to teach. At the end, I'll see if students apprehended these things. You adjust your assessment of the work that you're doing, of your pedagogy, live. And so you change based on the work that you're doing. And so my recommendation would be to work alongside students so that you can have conversations with them about the direction that the class is heading and what it is they would like to see.
Okay, here's an interesting one. How do we address the institutional dilemma that if capitalism is racist, but our goal is to provide future participants in capitalism? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so that's the problem, right? But the issue is this, and I've done this, and with Smash Prep, you can read about this in Revolutionary STEM Education. So the work should always be to create a citizenry that is civic-minded and is invested in social justice. So you can have students participate in this capitalist system, understanding that their participation is a way to change the system. So the idea is to give students the tools that they need should they want to participate in the system fully, and also if they want to participate in the system so that they can deconstruct it and make it more equitable. And so that's the work, right, of a critical pedagogue. Someone who's interested in critical pedagogy wants to create in students not only a foundational knowledge of the discipline that's being covered, but also a civic mindedness so students realize that they can use their learning as levers for.
Adjuncts are paid to teach classes, and after having been educated and practicing in their area of expertise, they may teach at many institutions and may be only teaching at night. If we're looking for institutional change, but many adjuncts are not truly part of the institution or the campus culture, what do we need to change about our institutional practices when it comes to that part of the community?
Yeah, so that's really interesting problem, and it's not unique to Green River. That is this is what kind of has carried the day in higher education, right? Adjuncts teach the majority of classes, specifically the majority of classes that full-time folks don't want to touch, right? The night classes and some of the other classes, and so it's hard if you're insisting on a certain level of kind of anti-racist pedagogy, but the folks who are teaching the majority of the classes are not brought into these conversations. It's difficult to have a real kind of paradigm shift in the way that you all do the work that you do. So what needs to happen is that there needs to be specialized professional development that's dedicated to adjuncts, and they need to be compensated for their time, right? So that's something that we've done at CSM. We had a course that I developed. It's called Critical Pedagogical Perspectives in Instructional Design. Adjuncts that wanted to participate were able to participate, and they were paid at their special rate to participate in the course. And so we had a fair amount of adjuncts. And so what has to happen is you have to develop a training series that trains trainers and make sure that there are monies available to compensate adjuncts for the additional time they're spending trying to make sure that the kind of climate change that you all are after is actually taking.
I always believed that before this work can begin, first we must work on our own biases and owning them. How do you begin the work on bias recognition and implicit bias?
I think first and foremost we have to recognize that we all have implicit biases. That's if you are a human being and you are alive, you have implicit biases. Our implicit biases are learned, they are cultural, and they are passed down from generation to generation. So what has to happen is you have to question metacognitively. You have to think about the way that you think, and that's the work that I'm undertaking. Why do I think about certain groups of people the way that I do? Why do I think about what do I think about the abilities or limitations of certain groups of people, and what is the genesis of that thought. And so that's the type of introspective, reflective work that has to take place. In the work that you do, whomever you interface with, you have a certain perception of that person. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. You have to figure out where that comes from and how you're supporting it, even with or without evidence from the person under question. And so I think my firm recommendation is to just question the genesis of the way that you think about certain people.
Okay, final question. How does the institution work on equity for students but ignore inequity among faculty and staff? I guess how would equity work that focuses on students? How would that then, as a ripple, affect the inequities among staff and faculty? Or
So
what would you say about that?
it has to be a two-pronged approach. You cannot ask faculty, staff, or administration to pour out if their cup is empty, right? They cannot feed folks if their cupboards are bare. So what has to happen is that you have to work towards an environment that is equitable for everyone there, right? Because people cannot give what they don't have. So whatever the focus is on creating equity with students, right? And those conversations should happen alongside students. The same types of conversations have to be happening with the campus community, the campus employee community. It has to be conjoined work. Otherwise, you can't provide equity for students if people who are tasked to deliver that equity feel themselves that they're being treated inequitably.
So you think they happen at the same time and not one before the other?
Yeah, it has to happen. It has to be coterminous. The work has to happen. It has to be both coterminous and concomitant. It has to happen at the same time, and it has to be a two-pronged approach. Otherwise, you'll never get to where you want to be with regard to equity.
Any final words for your Green River family?
What's up, family? I'm glad that I have an opportunity to have this conversation with y'all. If there are more questions, and I'm sure there will be, feel free to reach out. Maybe we'll do this video thing again. This is my first time trying this. Thank you to Rachel, who is awesome. I love y'all, and we'll be in touch.